Welcome students, myself Shanti, Assistant Professor of Economics, Avinashlingam Institute for Home Science and Higher Education for Women, Coimbatore, Tamil Nadu. I would like to present a brief outline on the topic parametric and non-parametric test. In this module, we will see the meaning, merits and demerits and what are the important parametric and non-parametric tests and the difference between these two tests. At the end of this module, you will be able to understand the concept of parametric and non-parametric test. Secondly, the differences between the parametric and non-parametric test and the various methods involved in the parametric and non-parametric test. Let us see the introduction of parametric and non-parametric test. In today's world, development in education relies on empirical research. The term research refers to the systematic method consisting of initiating the problem, formulating hypotheses, collecting the facts of data, analyzing the facts and reaching certain conclusions, neither in the form of solutions towards the concerned problem or in certain generalization for some theoretical formulation. In this regard, statistical tools have played a significant role in the analysis and interpretation of data. A statistical research can analyze data from the entire population or only on a sample basis. A population is nothing but the entire set of individuals the researcher is studying, and a sample is a smaller group within the population which is studied to make inferences about the larger population. To know the truth about the population, we generally collect data from a subset of the individuals of interest. When we talk about the research, hypothesis is generally considered as a principal instrument which enables us to make probability statements about population parameters. Hypothesis is a testable statement and it simply means a mere assumption to be proved or disproved. Basically, there are two types of hypotheses such as null and alternative hypothesis. A null hypothesis is the statement about the parameters which is usually a hypothesis of no differences and is denoted by H0. On the other hand, any hypothesis which is complementary to the null hypothesis is called an alternative hypothesis. Usually it is denoted by H1. Statisticians have developed several tests of hypotheses which are also known as the test of significance. When we talk about the testing of hypothesis, we have parametric and non-parametric test. Now, what is parametric and non-parametric test? The statistical tests which are make assumptions about the parameters of the population are known as parametric test. Well, the alternative technique where no assumption about the distribution of population parameter is made are known as non-parametric test. What are all the assumptions of parametric test? Normality of data, that is, the data has a normal distribution which is a bell-shaped curve. The next assumption is that homogeneity of variances, which means the data from multiple groups have the same variance. Another assumption is that linearity, that means there is a linear relationship among the variables. And the next is independence, which means the variables are independent of each other. If the data deviates from these assumptions, the parametric test could lead to incorrect conclusions. The major differences between the parametric and non-parametric tests lies in the assumption about the data to be analyzed. When the data are interval or ratio scale and the sample size is large, parametric statistical procedures are appropriate, which are based on the assumption that the data is in the study or drawn from the populations with normal distributions. On the other hand, when the data are either ordinal or nominal scale, it is generally inappropriate to make the assumption that the sampling distribution is normal. In this case, non-parametric statistical procedures are appropriate. Thus, non-parametric statistics are referred as the distribution-free test. The basic assumptions of non-parametric tests are the samples are randomly selected, and if two or more samples are used, they must be independent of each other. Now, let us see what all the major advantages of non-parametric methods are. The first advantage is that they can be used to test population parameters when the variables is not normally distributed. Secondly, they can be used when we have nominal or ordinal scale data. In some cases, the computations are easier than the parametric test. The non-parametric tests are easy to understand and there are few assumptions that have to be made, and the assumptions are easier to verify. However, there are certain disadvantages in non-parametric methods that they are less sensitive than parametric tests. Non-parametric methods uses less information and are less efficient than the parametric test. Now, let us discuss the key differences between parametric and non-parametric test. A statistical test in which specific assumptions are made about the population parameter is known as the parametric test, whereas a statistical test in which test is used in the case of non-metric independent variables is called non-parametric test. In the parametric test, the test statistics is based on distribution. On the other hand, the test statistics is arbitrary in the case of the non-parametric test. It is usually assumed that the measurement of variables of interest is done on interval or ratio level in the parametric test, whereas the variable of interest in non-parametric test are measured on the nominal or ordinal scale. In the parametric test, we can have complete information about the population parameters. Conversely, in the non-parametric test, there is no information about the population parameters. The parametric tests are applicable only for variables, but non-parametric tests are applicable to both variables and attributes. In the parametric test, we normally use Pearson coefficient of correlation, while in the non-parametric test, we generally use Spearman's rank correlation for measuring the degree of association between two quantitative variables. Next, we will see the important parametric test and its application in statistical analysis. The important parametric tests are t-test, z-test and f-test. All these tests are based on the assumptions of normality, that is, the source of data is considered to be normally distributed. Since these tests require certain assumptions about the population parameters from which the samples are drawn, these tests are known as parametric tests. The most important parametric test is t-test. A t-test is a statistical hypothesis test. It was introduced by W.S. Gossett under the pen name student. It is also referred as the student t-test. This test is used for judging the significant differences between the means of two samples in case of small samples, that is, the sample size is less than 30, and used when population variance is not known. This test statistics follows a t-distribution with n-1 degrees of freedom. To get the critical value of t, we have to refer the table value for t-distribution against n-1 degrees of freedom and the specific level of significance. By comparing the calculated value of t with critical value, we can accept or reject the null hypothesis. There are various t-tests, and the most commonly applied tests are the one sample and paired sample t-test. One sample t-tests are used to compare a sample mean with known population mean. On the other hand, two sample t-tests are used to compare either independent samples or dependent samples. Well, in the case of two samples are related, we use paired t-test for judging the significance of the mean difference between the two related samples. Generally, paired t-test used to compare the means before and after something is done to the samples. Say, for example, to determine the significant difference in blood pressure before and after administration of an experimental pressure substance, we use paired t-test. The next important parametric test is z-test. Z-test is generally used for comparing the mean of a sample to some hypothesis mean for a population in case of large samples, that is, the sample size is more than 30, or when the population variance is known. It is also used for judging the significance difference between means of two independent samples in case of large samples. For example, while comparing the average salaries of men versus women in an organization, we may use z-test. The other important parametric test is f-test. It is used to compare the variance of two independent samples, that is, for comparing one sample variance with another sample variance. It determines whether there is more variability in the scores of one sample than in the scores of another sample. Say, for example, we can compare the variability of both diameters from two different machines. In f-test, the samples can be any size. This test is also used in the context of analysis of variance. for judging the significance of more than 2 sample means at the same time. To obtain F statistics or F ratio, we have to divide the large sample variance by the smaller sample variance, and to test the null hypothesis of no difference between the sample variances, a table of F distribution is necessary. Now, let us see some important non-parametric tests which are often used in practice. First one is chi-square test. Chi-square test is one of the important non-parametric test and is used for comparing a sample variance to a theoretical population variance when categorical variables are used. This test is applicable in large number of problems, such as for testing the independence of attributes, to test the goodness of fit, for testing of linkage in genetic problems, to make comparison of sample variance with population variance, for testing the homogeneity of variances, and for testing the homogeneity of correlation coefficient. Next, we will see about the calculation of chi-square test. Calculation of chi-square statistics allows us to determine if the difference between the observed frequency distribution and the expected frequency distribution can be attributed to sampling variance. The first step involved in the calculation of chi-square test is formulation of null and alternative hypothesis. Secondly, we have to determine the appropriate significance level, that is basically 5% or 1% level of significance. After that, we need to calculate the expected frequencies on the basis of observed frequencies. Next, we have to make the statistical decisions by comparing the calculated chi-square value and the critical value. If the calculated value of chi-square is less than the table value of chi-square at certain level of significance, it is considered to be a good one. But if the calculated value of chi-square is greater than its table value, it is usually not considered to be a good one. Say for example, to analyze website awareness about 100 sample students, we start with the null hypothesis that the number of students aware of the website will be equal the number of students unaware of it. Thus, 50 people would be expected to respond yes or to be aware, and 50 would be expected to respond no or to be unaware. After the calculation of chi-square test, we would determine the significant level, that is whether the chi-square test is appropriate at the 5% or 1% level of significance. Based on that, we will accept or reject the null hypothesis. The next test is the sign test. The sign test is the simplest of the non-parametric test. Usually it is used to compare a single sample with some hypothesis value. The sign test is so called because it allocates a sign, either positive or negative sign, to each observation according to whether it is a greater or less than some hypothesis value, and considers whether this is substantially different from what we expect by chance. If any observations are exactly equal to hypothesis value, they are ignored and dropped from the sample. The sign test is basically classified as one sample sign test and two sample sign test. The one sample sign test is very simple non-parametric test and is applicable when we sample a continuous symmetrical population. On the other hand, two sample sign test applicable in problems where we deal with paired samples. In that, each pair of values can be replaced with a positive sign if the first value of the first sample is greater than the first value of the second sample, and we take negative sign if the first value of the first sample is less than the first value of second sample. In case when the two sample values are equal, the concerning pair is discarded. The sign test is extremely simple to perform. However, the major disadvantage is that it simply allocates a sign to each observation according to whether it lies above or below some hypothesis value and does not take the magnitude of the observation into account. An alternative to that does account for the magnitude of the observation is the Wilcoxon rank test. This test is used to study when we have matched pairs, such as a study when we compare the output of two similar machines, or where some subjects are studied in context of before and after experiment. A non-parametric alternative to the unpaired t-test is the Wilcoxon rank sum test, which is also known as the Mann-Whitney test. This is used when comparison is made between two independent groups with ordinal level variables. The next test is the Kruskal-Wallis test, which is otherwise known as H test. The Kruskal-Wallis test is used to find out the significant differences between sample means for two sample cases. Firstly, with ordinal level variables, and secondly, when the data are based on an interval or ratio scale. And this test is basically used to test whether the independent random samples come from identical universe or not. Another non-parametric test is one sample runs test. One sample runs test is used to judge the randomness of a sample on the basis of the order in which the observations are taken. The next important non-parametric test is Spearman rank correlation. This test is applicable when the data are not available to use in numerical form for doing correlation analysis, but the information is sufficient to rank the data as first, second and third, and we work out the coefficient of rank correlation. In fact, the rank correlation coefficient is a measure of correlation that exists between the two sets of ranks of observations and not on the numerical values of the data. Towards the end of this module, each one of you would have learned the concept of hypothesis, types of hypothesis, meaning of parametric and non-parametric test, basic assumptions, key differences between parametric and non-parametric methods, advantages and disadvantages, and important tests of parametric and non-parametric methods. By learning the key difference between parametric and non-parametric test, you would have understand the pros and cons of parametric and non-parametric test while applying in the research. Through the knowledge about the application of parametric and non-parametric test, you would learn to make a choice between parametric and the non-parametric test.